That's what it is. And anything else you want to say to the fans?
I just want everybody to tune in Saturday night and put on a great show and a great performance, regardless of who I fight. And shout out to Dante's Boxing Nation, man. They're my people, man. They're good people.
The way we studied the tape, I had a feeling that he was going to do all that herky-jerky movement. It was going to be awkward. See, if you're throwing combinations at somebody and they're like this, they're southpaw, then that means naturally their head is going to naturally start to lean in this angle, okay? Back, over, it's going to drop down into this angle. And as soon as they switch this way, now it's going to drop down to this angle. And this guy, not only was he switching in front of me, see, it's here, see, so it's almost similar to doing this, but this is not switching. This is not switching, and it's putting your head on both sides. But he was getting his head on both sides here. But then when he backed up, wow.
Sure.
Wow. See that? It's awkward, man. I mean, I don't know too many fighters that do that. I've never faced a fighter that ever did that.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So that clip you just watched right there, that was the post-fight press conference of the Keith Thurman versus Leonard Bundu fight, with Thurman basically reflecting on his experience going 12 rounds with Leonard Bundu. And as you look at the clip playing right now, you see the marks and the bruises on Keith Thurman's face, which clearly indicates Keith Thurman was in a serious fight that night. I guess I would say Keith Thurman's toughest fights probably was Luis Collazo and the Leonard Bundu fight. As we all know, Keith Thurman, he was able to knock down Bundu, but he couldn't finish the job. As he explained, Leonard Bundu was very slippery and very awkward, switching back from righty to lefty. So he ended up going 12 rounds with the very elusive Leonard Bundu. And this is what makes this possible fight in August on free TV so intriguing, which would possibly be Errol Spence versus Leonard Bundu. We already seen what Errol Spence did with Chris Algieri, a fighter that Manny Pacquiao and Amir Khan and Ruslan Provodnikov could not knock out. Errol Spence, not only did he win every single round, but he closed the show in impressive fashion, by way of contrast. Now, when it comes to Leonard Bundu, being Keith Thurman's former opponent, I remember Keith Thurman, after Errol Spence knocked out Chris Algieri, Keith Thurman, he was actually comparing his level of opposition to Spence knocking out Chris Algieri. Now, Keith Thurman did give Errol Spence his props knocking out Algieri. He said it was an impressive win, but at the same time, he called Chris Algieri a chump and said that his resume was much better than Errol Spence's. So now Errol Spence is actually about to, or possibly, face an opponent that has already been in the ring with Keith Thurman. Not only has this guy been in the ring with Keith Thurman, but he was one of Keith Thurman's most difficult fights. And Bundu was an opponent that Keith Thurman could not knock out. So once again, if Errol Spence goes in there and he steamrolls Leonard Bundu the way he did Chris Algieri, what does Keith Thurman and the rest of the welterweights say then? You know, guys, I can't recall the last time I've seen an undefeated welterweight receive this amount of respect from all the other welterweights in the division. Guillermo Rigondeaux not only is pound for pound one of the best fighters in the world, but he is pound for pound number one, the most avoided fighter in the world. And Errol Spence is coming very close to taking that title. Do you guys know how difficult it is for Errol Spence to get a fight? I'll tell you right now. Following Errol Spence's knockout win over Chris Algieri, he was already supposed to get the Kell Brook fight next, but Kell Brook and Team Brook, of course, they turned that down, and they decided to go with Jesse Vargas. right? So then they threw another title eliminator bout in front of Errol Spence and ordered him to fight the undefeated power puncher Konstantin Paramarev, and really to no surprise, he pulled out of the fight. Now, there were multiple indications that Paramarev wasn't going to take that fight. The one thing I notice is usually when you see a report that Errol Spence is ordered to fight this guy or that guy, right? In this case, he was ordered to fight Paramarev. What I noticed was you never heard anything from Team Paramarev. Matter of fact, I actually interviewed Abel Sanchez, which is Panamarev's trainer, and I said, what do you think about your guy being the mandatory, or basically being in a title eliminator bout facing Errol Spence? And Abel Sanchez, he says something that you don't usually hear a fighter's trainer say. And he basically said, that's going to be a very difficult fight. Errol Spence right now is very good. He just kept praising Errol Spence. And quite frankly, the consensus was Abel Sanchez, he didn't think that his fighter was ready to go up against a talent like Errol Spence. But most fighters aren't going to be ready to go up against Errol Spence. And that's just the fact of the matter. So the fact that we didn't hear Panamarev say anything about how eager he is, how ready he is to fight against Errol Spence, and you have his own trainer basically praising the shit out of Errol Spence, that was a good indication that the fight probably wasn't going to come to fruition. And then, of course, we heard the reports that Panamarev, he was injured, and that's why the fight didn't take place. But to this day, there haven't been any type of reports of what type of injury Panamarev he sustained. No reports of a sprained ankle, broken ribs, or whatever, right? It was just straight vague and to the point. He's injured, we're not taking the fight, right? So whatever reason, Panamarev, he pulled out of the fight, okay? And then Errol Spence or Team Spence, they start looking for other opponents. This is when they offered a fight to Lamont Peterson. He turned down the fight. They also offered a fight to Sammy Vasquez. Sammy Vasquez is a very good undefeated prospect. He's like the Canelo of the Al Heyman PBC train. That's what I call him, at least. So Sam Vasquez, he turned down the fight as well. Now keep in mind, guys, the guys that are turning down these fights are given an opportunity to fight for a world championship. All they have to do is get past Errol Spence, which obviously wouldn't be easy for anybody, okay? So you have all of these fighters that basically turn down a fight with Errol Spence, and then they finally find one guy who accepts the challenge, and that is Leonard Bundu. Now, I thought it was interesting, not really that he said this, but just the fact that this was one of the first things that he said in one of his first interviews talking about Errol Spence. One of the first things that Leonard Bundu said was, Errol Spence is going to be much tougher than Keith Thurman was. And his vague explanation was the fact that Errol Spence is an aggressive fighter. He's much more aggressive than Keith Thurman. He comes for the knockout. But then Bundu, he kind of contradicted himself, because then he said, but that actually plays right into my game plan for him to actually come to me. Meaning he's going to basically set up the trap, and he expects Errol Spence to walk right into the trap. The bottom line is, it says a lot when you have a fighter like Leonard Bundu, who hasn't even been in a ring with Errol Spence. He's been in the ring with Keith Thurman. He hasn't been in the ring with Errol Spence. Usually when you ask a fighter, like, do you think compare Errol Spence to Keith Thurman, a lot of fighters, they'll say stuff like, well, I haven't been in the ring with Errol Spence yet, so I don't know. But I find it interesting that even though Bundu hasn't been in the ring with Errol Spence, he's already projecting that Errol Spence is going to be a much more difficult fight than Keith Thurman was. That is very telling, guys. It gives you more of an idea of how much these fighters respect Errol Spence's skill and talent, okay? Once again, if you just really, really put it all together, let's take Sean Porter, for example. After Errol Spence knocked out Chris Algieri, Sean Porter, who lost to Kell Brook, he said he would pick Errol Spence to beat Kell Brook. And he made it sound like Errol Spence would beat him easy. Okay? Once again, Kell Brook is someone that Sean Porter lost to. Right? So what that obviously implies is if Errol Spence is good enough to beat Kell Brook in Sean Porter's eyes, that means that Errol Spence is ready for all of the welterweights in the division, right? That's the only thing that can mean. But the respect goes beyond other fighters in the welterweight division. You also have a lot of boxers and trainers, professional boxers and trainers as well, outside of the welterweight division, that have also basically crowned Errol Spence as already the best welterweight in the division. I've asked trainers like Abel Sanchez, Jeff Mayweather, and more. And they all said, well, this is the question I asked them. I asked them, who would you say would be the last welterweight standing if there was somewhat of a tournament? In other words, who is the most talented welterweight and who do you believe will go the furthest right now? And all of them said Errol Spence. I remember a long time ago, way before Floyd Mayweather fought Manny Pacquiao, I was interviewing Freddie Roach. And I asked him, I said, Freddie, who do you think will be the next pound for pound king? Like when Mayweather and Pacquiao are gone, who do you think the torch gets passed down to as the next pound for pound king? Now, I expected Freddie Roach to possibly say a name like Gennady Golovkin, Canelo Alvarez, Roman Gonzalez. I expected him to mention a name like that. But he actually surprised me when he said the kid from Texas. Soon as I asked him the question, before I could even get the whole question out, he said the kid from Texas. He said, what's the guy's name? The guy from Texas. And that's when I said Errol Spence, and he said Errol Spence. He said that guy right there is going to be the next pound for pound king. He's going to take Floyd Mayweather's spot. That's pretty much what he said in the interview. So when it comes to Errol Spence and people talking about how good he is, it's not like you just have just one random guy with this wild ass theory that Errol Spence, for no reason at all, is the best welterweight or possibly the next Floyd or the next Andre Ward or whatever the case may be. You guys are actually hearing praise from fighters in Errol Spence's own division. You're hearing praise from many different boxing trainers, okay? So it's not just a coincidence when it comes to how good Errol Spence is. And Leonard Bundu, he clearly feels the same way. Once again, this will be very interesting to see how Bundu does. It'll be interesting to see how Errol Spence reacts to the switching back from righty to lefty, like Keith Thurman was explaining at the beginning of this video. It'll be very interesting to see how Errol Spence deals with that style of fighting. I mean, if you could go 12 rounds with one-time Keith Thurman, once again, just imagine if Errol Spence can knock this guy out. This is the reason why I think this is a very good matchup. Now, even though I wanted to see Spence versus Panamarev, this fight is just as good because it is going to give us a great level of contrast when it comes to Keith Thurman and how he did against Leonard Bundu. So I'll talk more about this fight when it's more official and when it's closer to August, but that's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
This is Bobby, and you're watching Dante's Boxing Nation.